Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you're all right. We've been discussing the last couple of weeks about what we mean by I believe in God. And we've looked briefly at each of those terms, the I and the God. And last time we concentrated on the I part of it, looking at ourselves. What sort of people are we? What are our hopes and expectations? What and who have influenced us from outside? And we concluded that much of the problem was to do with I, or the me, being the centre of our existence, and that thus prolonged, meaningful relationships with others, and yes, even God himself, might not now be possible. The rise of the generation snowflake, as we called it, and that mentality, and the occurrence of what we now call no-fault divorce, and the uncertainty caused by alternative facts and fake news, and the sinister implications of the political philosophy of populism have all come together to create and exacerbate this situation. So today, I want to talk briefly about what we mean by believe. And in so doing, I want to take you back 24 years to a course on adult education I did with some people in my last parish. Of course, there were no smartphones then, no social media, no sophisticated technological developments that we now take for granted and rely on and frame our lives and our thinking. But it's interesting to compare that reflection in 1997 and how to see how much of it has actually come true, and how in some senses the basic problems are still as prevalent today. So this is, just to start off, this is what we said in 1997. Two factors are involved in our believing or capacity to believe: our own experience as persons and what is outside us, what we've inherited or been told by someone else. Our experience may be painful. Certainly, each of us will not have had the same experiences in life. We may have had to endure great sorrow, bereavement, humiliation, or we may have had a joyful life. In our religion, to claim that it should provide what we need or want is false. A commitment to God and our Lord is just that, a commitment and a giving of all to God himself. In this context, there are no prevailing moral codes. The self is the sole arbiter of morals, and all forms of absolute right and wrong are to be rejected, because one person's truth is as valid as anyone else's, and everyone can ruthlessly pursue self-interest with no regard for the rights of others. But there is a need for absolute moral values in the face of market forces. Ministers have picked up the palpable unease about standards and behaviour and attitudes. What is beyond them is realising that they have actually helped to create this malaise. And when I say ministers here, I mean political ministers, not spiritual ones. Having decided that self-interest is the engine of national happiness, they are unable to recognise the destructive forces it unleashes. So obsessive is their belief that the market solves every ill, that they cannot grasp that setting citizens against each other for personal gain, rather than working together for our common good, helps destroy the ethical basis of a community. Theologians, on the other hand, will have their work vilified. The idea they embody, that we should live by codes of conduct that may limit the pursuit of personal fulfillment in the interests of others who may be adversely affected, is rejected as illiberal and authoritarian. And the most illiberal of people nowadays are actually those who claim to be liberal, but who at the same time reject any other opinion than their own. So we need to reconstruct community values, we said. Only absolute moral values can truly protect the individual freedom from being trampled underfoot, and produce a society based on principles of justice, solidarity, honesty, and openness. We must turn instead to fraternity and construct a new politics of community values. We have to build on moral foundations larger than consumption and self-interest, and find a commitment to the common good. This situation is not new, as we said all those years ago. Many years before, Dr. Jacob Bronowski, in his television series, The Ascent of Man, said something very pertinent as he stood in the pond at Auschwitz into which the ashes of 4 million people had been flushed. And he claimed that that catastrophe was caused by hubris and arrogance when man became the sole arbiter of his own behaviour. And so if people's concern is only for themselves, there is no room for God or anyone else. We've thrown away our sense of community and have become isolated, saturated and arrogant people who do not really know what is right anymore or where we're going in life. This starts from childhood, where parents give in all too readily to the incessant demands of their children, and thus they never learn the meaning of disappointment, patience or doing without. We looked at T.S. Eliot's extract from Murder in the Cathedral about the void in which people were living and partly living, as the chorus said, and admitted that that actually had been true for a long time. So it may be that religion is not what people are looking for, but let us consider what a commitment to God might mean. It is a commitment that will speak the truth. Jesus said, "Anyone who wants to save his life will lose it. Anyone who loses his life for my sake will find it." This is absolutely true, and we can live and die by it, but it will not fit into the market-led mentality. Secondly, religion involves community living, within which this truth can be exercised. It means that not everything is earned or bought, but some things are given free of charge, unmerited, like God's love. We can slowly pick away at this presupposition rather than having to feel that we're swimming against the tide. St. Paul spoke of the cross as madness to the pagans and a scandal to Jews, but life to those on the way to salvation. We are preaching a crucified Christ, and we cannot expect that philosophy to sit easily with the philosophies we have spent our time thinking about, and yet why should it? It is the exact opposite, but I believe with all my heart that it is in fact the truth. So then, in 1997, I asked the people present the following questions and recorded some of their answers. What do you mean when you say, "I believe in God"? The answers to this were many and varied. I believe in the resurrection and things related to the Bible. The message behind what has been taught. But this is not always the answer to everything, like, how did I come into being? I know there is a God. Something in me tells me this. There must be an all-powerful being. Everywhere you go, people worship something. I believe because I want something to hold on to. The thought of there being nothing makes me feel afraid. Even when we have problems in life that cannot be solved, I still want someone to turn to who I feel can help me. If I am bereaved, a belief in God gives me hope that I will see my partner again. There is so much evil in the world, and therefore we need to have a God of goodness to believe in, so that somehow evil will not be triumphant. And the next question was, how do you see believing in the future? This is quite revealing when you consider it's all those years ago. Maybe there will be a dramatic decline in church-going. There is certainly not so much emphasis on believing in schools now. People seem to be so busy that they do not have time to think of God and what commitment to him might mean. He seems to be relegated to the fringes of our lives. Peer pressure plays an important part, especially for young people, for whom believing does not now seem to be fashionable or cool. The culture of the marketplace and self-indulgent does not seem to help. There may be more fundamentalists and extreme sects, and this is worrying. Even today, belonging to religious groups have cult suicides and extreme practices. This cannot be good. A structure that is imposed on them, which they seem to want, but within which there is no flexibility, and then they can be trapped. Many people will simply survive with no religion, no belief as such, but this may not mean that they're bad people. There are very many young people who do not believe, who are extremely generous and good-natured, for example. There are many parents who would like their children to follow something and believe in something, but they do not want to do so themselves. Young people find the idea of hierarchy and authority difficult to accept, and hence a centralized church may cease to speak to their hearts. But this does not mean that there is no authority and self-discipline in their consciences. Are we wrong to imply simply that to get them to church is the only thing that matters? The Pope, as such in this context, is meaningless to a lot of people. He has no impact on their lives whatsoever. And we often find that Rome deliberately puts obstacles in the way of people believing, and this can stifle growth in the way the Lord wants. A similar situation exists in ecumenical circles. What has happened from below, from people meeting and praying together, is far more significant than the statements and documents that are issued from above. People and ministers have come together and learned to respect each other as people and their own traditions, but this did not happen by decree, only through their own goodness, their own experience, and the pastoral needs of their people. Many people want to go back to the good old days of certainty, but don't know how to do it. There will certainly be some changes in structural believing, especially in the Catholic Church, because there are fewer and fewer priests. Something will have to happen. Does no priest mean no church? What about the basic communities in South America which survive and flourish without a lot of clerical input? It may be that people will have to take much more responsibility than at present for their formation and the living out of their faith, but are they willing to do so? Present trends indicate not. This was in 1997, remember. There seems to be a great desire to do things your own way, a sort of cafeteria Christianity, where you take the bits you want out and leave the others. Furthermore, we now have a culture of the private, where our own resources buy our health and education. This purchasing power has often made people vulgar and demanding. For them, what they have and what they own is everything. Their arrogant ownership has given them the power over what they own and often made them arrogant, wanting satisfaction for their investment. It is inevitable that this has already coloured their believing and what it means, and the situation will probably get a lot worse as time goes on. To ask, then, do I believe in God, is very frightening. We know what we want the answer to be, but we fear what it really is, namely that there is nothing actually in us, and that therefore our church life, our efforts to form our children and so on, might be a bit of a sham. For some of us, it is a purely intellectual matter. Do I think that God is a credible thing? Can I accept the teaching that there is a God and that he or she is a God for me, who meets my needs and answers my questions? The problem about our believing in God or not is precisely this. We ask ourselves, under what circumstances can this be possible for us? What needs to happen to convince us? And what if things go wrong or not the way we expect or hope? For priests to say, well, it's a matter of faith, is actually quite patronising, especially when they expect you to accept that. We cannot simply sweep away what we cannot answer, but we must ask what sort of answers we want and why do we want to ask the question, and whose interests are paramount in our asking of it. What has happened to us is that we've become entirely subjective. That is, we're asking these questions from our own point of view, as if believing was a matter of satisfying ourselves, providing for our needs, answering our questions, and providing a way of life that we deem to be reasonable and acceptable. And this is not what we learn from Scripture. When Jesus asked his disciples, "Do you believe in me?" he did not mean, "Do you accept what I say? Do I sound reasonable to you?" He was implying a much more dynamic and all-embracing commitment, not "Do you believe me?" but "Do you believe in me?" which is quite different. This presupposes a willingness to commit one's whole self to our Lord without asking anything for yourself. If anyone wants to save his life, he will lose it, and so on. This is a faith that is not subjective or self-indulgent, but a commitment entirely to another person and all that he stands for. Worship means engaging yourself totally in the object of your worship, not fulfilling your own needs. And this is what we've lost in our present society, the ability to worship. Our technical sophistication has made us cynical and self-centered. We feel that anyone who worships is really quite obsessional and needs treatment. So all that was said in 1997, and I'm sure it resonates with many of you as what's been happening in the present. So let us just pick out a few of those comments then. The comment about the lack of absolute values in morals, that you're the own arbiter of it. Well, we've said that before. That is certainly the case now. Not listening to anyone who contradicts you. Too many people, for example, in the media have their own agenda, and they're not actually interested in listening to the person they're interviewing, or the person they're interviewing is not interested in them answering the question that they've been asked, but something else. And that also applies in our discussions and conversations as well. The talk about market forces has accelerated immensely, of course. We're now controlled by the market, and we're told what is good for us or will make us happy. As a consequence, many preachers proclaim a gospel of the marketplace. That is, believe in this and your life will be happy, perfect and worry-free. This is a lie and can find its most sinister expression in religious fanaticism, as Father Timothy Ratcliffe comments in his book Alive in God. Tragically, hundreds of young Muslims from the West set off to the Middle East to fight for the horrendous death cult ISIS or its many manifestations. Surely young people who have no future and are unrecognized are drawn by the lure of a great adventure that asks of them everything and promises them everything. As long as people are without hope, such a deadly summons will continue to seduce them. I'm sure that's something based around what's happening with the Taliban at the moment. They've taken over Afghanistan. They have this incredible ideology which is against women, against anyone who doesn't believe that they believe. It's incredibly frightening. And I had a discussion with Father Michael the other day about this matter, and he is extremely well read and well informed about these matters, living as he does in Nigeria, where there is a strong Muslim presence and where there are some extreme groups like Boko Haram and the Fulani tribesmen who want to take over the Christian country. And so he's actually living with it, and he knows far more about it than we do. And he said that he was quite convinced that what had happened in Taliban in particular had absolutely nothing to do with religion. It was all to do with money and power and control. And so within that context, it's difficult to discover and live the truth of anything anymore. With regard to the decline in church-going, that has now happened, and I think it will happen even more now we've come into the end of the official COVID restriction period. Many people have not returned to church, who are young and fit. It's not that they're elderly and ill. Some of them are worried, some of them are a bit paranoid, and some of them are just lazy. But there is no doubt that that will not happen in the scale that it happened before. And matters like baptism and First Communion will be very problematic when often people who are seeking them are not members of the community at all, and yet they want to step into it for a brief period, which cannot really continue because it's not facing up to the truth of your situation, which of course will make me extremely unpopular. But we can't carry on doing this. Just can't carry on having people coming and making promises and then breaking them, So that's going to be a problem, that is going to be a problem. Because they are never in a church or part of the community, and they convince themselves, I don't need to go to church to say my prayers. Yes, you do, actually. It's not going to church, it's being in a community. That there was a book written some years ago, I quoted you before, by Cole Morton, the independent journalist, and he was talking about the decline in the Church of England and the other options that were on offer. And he said, just think, on a Sunday you can go to this nice place where there is somewhere to park safely, and it's nicely lit, a little bit of music playing in the background, and you can walk around and look at nice things and obviously have the buzz of buying them, and then have a little break and have a coffee and a cheesecake with a friend, and you can go back then to the buying and so on and feel very happy with what you bought, or you can sit in a drafty barn of a building listening to some fish-faced character calling you a sinner. And let's be fair, if that's what it is, there isn't really any competition, is there? But hopefully it isn't what it is, but that's what he said. And interestingly enough, the Dominican Father Cornelius Ernst, who died some years ago, is quoted in Father Ratcliffe's book. When we were talking about subjective faith, he said, "I cannot allow that God can only be adored in spirit and in truth by the individual introverted upon himself and detached from all that might disturb and solicit his heart. It must be possible to find and adore God in the complexity of human experience." And so we are and have to be a community people. And that's the question we're going to ask next week. The complexity of human experience is effectively all we are and all that influences us today. Is it possible to adore and worship God? And what does that mean? What might militate against it? Can we call our lives with him an adventure that excites and challenges us even still?